Well, Larry, thank you for that brief introduction. Last time it was way too long. Although Tom Truscott just gave my talk. So that makes my job a lot easier. You know, it's customary for a speaker to stand up and say how pleased he is to be there, whether he is or not. But I can tell you that I am sincerely delighted to be with my favorite roundtable in the whole world, the Chicago Civil War Roundtable, my hometown roundtable, and you know, for my money, the best darn group of Civil War enthusiasts in the country. And it is really an honor to be here with you. Now, I look out on this audience and I see so many familiar faces. I see some just really distinguished and discriminating people. I see Larry Strickling back here, my good friend, Tom Truscott, my dear friend, Bruce Allardyce, Donnie Case, all of whom have something in common with me. However, I anticipated that reaction because there seems to be another team in Chicago that vies for the White Sox fan base. So being a man of equal opportunity, I thought I'd bring something we could all agree on. It's going to be a long season for White Sox fans, which is something Cubs fans are used to, of course. Well, I think Bob mentioned at the outset in his opening welcome remarks this evening that he had asked for the topic that we're going to address tonight, the story of the Bermuda 100 campaign. Your last couple of field trips, I think, Bob, have been to the Overland campaign and to Petersburg. And, of course, Bermuda 100 fits in there and sort of in the middle, simultaneous, frankly, with the Overland campaign. And it's pretty darn hard to compete, whether it be in 1864 or in 2011, for attention in the Bermuda 100 actions with the bloodbath that was the Overland campaign from the wilderness to Cold Harbor. And consequently, I think this becomes one of the least studied and least understood of all of the campaigns in the Eastern Theater. As many of you bibliophiles know, there are really only two studies on the campaign, both of them published within 6 months of one another, and they're both very good books, and they take different perspectives on the campaign. So if you don't have these in your library, they are out of print but readily available on used book sites. Backdoor to Richmond by Glenn Robertson, and the Bermuda 100 campaign by Herb Schilling. You may not know Herb. Herb is a physician, but has written relatively widely on the Civil War. Of course, Glenn Robertson has published a great deal and is out at the Command and Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. Those books were published in the late 1980s, and there really hasn't been anything on Bermuda 100 since. But like most speakers or authors, you have to stand up for your topic and its significance and its importance. Otherwise, why the hell are you here? And so I'm going to tell you that the Bermuda 100 campaign, I'm not going to try to convince you that it was all that significant, although it's not derivative. But it was certainly a campaign that had lots and lots of impacts. There were, in a 16-day period in May of 1864, there were 8 engagements, which we're going to talk about very briefly tonight. 8 engagements that resulted in more than 10,000 casualties. I don't know how many of you all could name. There'd be a good trivia question for even my friend Bruce, who might not be able to get all 8 battles of the Bermuda 100 campaign. But it is a campaign with a lot of interest. It's a very complicated campaign. To try to explain it in 55 minutes is going to be a tough assignment, but bear with me. We're going to go through it with some of these PowerPoints, and there is a handout on your table that has the tables of organization. I am not going to try to make you all follow the action on the brigade level, but there are the names of these officers that were involved in the campaign and the tables of organizations. Now, the officer that is most associated with the campaign is our friend on the screen here, Benjamin Franklin Butler. Butler was born in Deerfield, New Hampshire in 1818. His father was an officer in the War of 1812, was a notorious privateer, died when Butler was about 4 months old, and he moved with his widowed mother to Lowell, Massachusetts. He attended what is now Colby College in Maine, and then studied law and established a law practice in Lowell, in which he developed a reputation as a man of the people, primarily by defending the interests of Irish immigrants and other folks who didn't have a lot of means. This reputation for standing up for the little guy was the launching pad for Butler's political career. And Butler served as a member of the Massachusetts legislature in both houses. He was also interested in the military. And Butler was a brigadier general in the Massachusetts militia by the time he was 40 years old. But politics were always first with Butler. He, from the very start, he was a character of somebody who knew him as a boy, called him, quote, the dirtiest, sauciest, lyingest child on our road, which perhaps made him qualified for politics. He was a Democrat, and he was a Massachusetts representative to the 1860 Democratic Presidential Convention, that unfortunate aggregation down in Charleston, in which he voted 57 consecutive times for guess who for the Democratic nomination?
Davis.
Jefferson Davis. And when, of course, Davis did not win the nomination, Butler was a supporter of John C. Breckinridge, who was most associated with the secessionist elements in the South. But when the war occurred, the Butler's loyalty to the Union was unquestioned, and his Massachusetts military unit, as you know, was one of the first to respond to the crisis in Washington. He occupied secessionist Baltimore, and then he was assigned to command down at Fort Monroe, at the tip of the Virginia Peninsula, where he refused to return runaway slaves, which he called contraband of war, a term that has resonated to this very day and was picked up during the war, and of course anticipated the war policy of the North, which eventually included abolition as one of the goals of the war. So Butler was a person of considerable influence as a war Democrat, and because of that influence, and because of some minor successes on the North Carolina coast in 1861, Butler was given the assignment to command the Army forces in the combined operation against New Orleans in the winter and spring of 1862. But not everyone gave Butler that job because they thought Butler was so well qualified. The Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Wells, commented that all would be relieved were this restless officer sent to the far southwest, where his energy, activity, and impulsive force be employed in desultory, aquatic, and shore duty. Well, Butler, as we know, was a full participant in the capture of New Orleans and became the military governor or mayor for all practical purposes of New Orleans, where he earned a reputation and nicknames of Spoons Butler or Beast Butler for alleged theft of civilian silverware or his treatment of the New Orleans ladies. The aroma of corruption was always around Butler's office. He traded and confiscated goods, but nobody could ever really pin any corruption on Butler. He was shrewd, sharp, able, without conscience or modesty. A bad man to have against you in a criminal case, said one of the New Orleanians. But by December 1862, Butler had rendered himself dispensable. He had insulted the consuls from the Netherlands, from France, from England, who had offices in New Orleans, and this corruption reputation just was enough for Lincoln to remove him from command. And so Butler would spend most of the next year on the stump, giving war speeches around the country, supporting the hardening war policies of the Lincoln administration, and being one of the staunchest war Democrats out there in the public eye. In fact, he became so popular and so much in demand as a political figure that Lincoln began to get extremely worried about Butler as a potential rival for the White House in November of 1864. And so it was thought that it would be a good idea to find a military post for Butler to get him off the stump, out of the political limelight, and put him someplace where he could be involved in military activities. And of course, as you know from your quiz, he was assigned command of what became known as the Army of the James. Now, a couple of words about the Army of the James. It was not a small organization. It numbered almost 40,000 troops. But it was an unusual army in the Civil War days in that it was the most prevalent volunteer-commanded army in the war. Less than 30% of the officers in the Army of the James had any pre-war military experience, for example. Most of the troops in the Army were from New England, small towns in New England. Lots of new conscripts were in the Army of the James. There was one Illinois regiment in the Army of the James, the 39th Illinois, but otherwise it was primarily comprised of New England and New York units. Butler organized the Army into two corps. One of them was commanded by this fellow, Quincy Adams Gilmore. Quincy Adams Gilmore is not exactly a household name in Civil War history. He had most recently been in charge of the Department of the South, headquartered down in the South Atlantic, futilely trying to capture Charleston, South Carolina. When Grant developed the command for Butler of the Army of the James, he was looking for troops to add to Butler's command, and all of these idle troops down in the South Atlantic coast were available. Grant had no idea that Gilmore was going to come with him, but Gilmore did. He was a trained engineer officer, but a man with precious few skills to command in the field. The second Corps commander, and now Gilmore had what was known as the 10th Corps, and the second Corps commander was this fellow, someone you probably have heard of, William Farrar Baldy Smith, professional officer, a man with some fairly decent skills as a commander, experience as a Corps commander earlier in the war, but plagued with the fatal tendency to be completely critical of everyone who ever supervised him, everybody who ever commanded him. He was dismissed from the Army after the Battle of Fredericksburg for his undermining of General Burnside. His career languished until Grant plucked him off the shelf, and you'll be studying something about Smith this spring when you go on your field trip, because it would be Smith who built upon the idea of opening the new supply line that lifted the siege of Chattanooga in October of 1863 that the soldiers called the Cracker Line. This impressed Ulysses Grant very much, and Grant became loyal to Smith, and so when the new army was being formed on the Virginia Peninsula, Grant tapped Smith as the man that he really thinks is going to be the brains and the military skill behind the efforts of the Army of the James. So you have Butler with Gilmore and Smith. Now how about the Confederates? As you know again from your quiz, thanks very much, Tom, the commander of the Confederate forces at the outset of the Bermuda Hunter campaign is our old friend, George Edward Pickett. Now, Pickett, as we all know, had a very bad day in July of 1863 in Pennsylvania. His division was shattered, and what was left of Pickett's division was sent to backwater areas of the Confederacy to recoup, and Pickett was given command of what was known as the Department of North Carolina and Southern Virginia, with headquarters in Petersburg. Pickett's primary responsibility that fall and winter of 1864 was to protect the railroad that connected Wilmington, North Carolina, the only functioning Atlantic coast port for the Confederacy, with Richmond, a rail line that ran through Weldon, North Carolina, up through Petersburg, through Chesterfield County, and into Richmond. Pickett had a very small force of about 13,000 men spread across this giant geographical area running from the James River all the way down to Wilmington, North Carolina. Now, Pickett would spend most of the winter of 1864 orchestrating small offensives in coastal towns of North Carolina, places like Washington and Plymouth and New Bern. But Pickett was not insensible to this growing behemoth that was to be the Army of the James, that was centered around Fort Monroe at the tip of the Virginia Peninsula. Now on the Union side, this fellow, who we all recognize, and we all know his contributions, his strategic contribution to the war in 1864. When Grant arrives in Washington, he has the plan to launch 5 simultaneous offensives against the Confederacy in the spring. And does this little thing work, Larry? I guess it does. 2 of the offensives are not on this map. Of course, his protege Sherman will be assaulting Joe Johnston's army in North Georgia with it targeting Atlanta. Another Union army will be targeting Mobile, Alabama on the Gulf Coast, but 3 armies will be involved in assaults, offensives in Virginia. Of course, the major army, the Army of the Potomac, under George Meade, will be moving from the Culpeper area here down against Lee's Army of Northern Virginia with the eventual target of Richmond. Where Lee's army goes, you two will follow. But the 2 kind of subordinate offensives that were designed to operate simultaneously with Meade was Franz Sigel's offensive up the Shenandoah Valley, targeting the railroad depot town of Stanton. If I could, there it is, there's Stanton, the end of the Virginia Central Railroad that connected the Shenandoah Valley's agricultural wealth with the Confederate capital of Richmond. And then, of course, the topic that we're going to be talking about tonight, and that's this offensive with Butler, moving by water up the James River from the peninsula and targeting Richmond from the south. Now, one of the controversies in this campaign is what exactly Grant told Butler at their meeting on April 1st, 1864, in regard to his mission. They were similar, there's similar stories you get from the 2 officers, but there's a couple of critical differences. Grant says that you have 2 primary responsibilities, General Butler. This is what Grant explains after the campaign. 1, establish a firm base on the peninsula between the James and Appomattox rivers for future operations. And 2nd, seize the railroad that runs between Richmond and Petersburg with the interesting name, the Richmond and Petersburg Railroad, ironically, and deprive the Confederates of its use to reinforce Lee's army from the south. And thirdly, when Meade is successful in driving Lee's army back down to Richmond, then Butler is to move up from the south and cooperate with Meade in a dual offensive against Richmond. Butler will say that his primary responsibility was to secure this peninsula, and the Bermuda Hundred, incidentally, is an area of several hundred square miles, as Tom told us, between these 2 rivers, with the point of the peninsula being down here at Bermuda Hundred on the James River. And incidentally, a hundred was a term used in England and in Germany to refer to a subdivision of land or a subdivision of population. Oftentimes, 10 families would represent a hundred. And that terminology came over to colonial Virginia and to colonial Maryland, and grants of land were called hundreds. So that's the origin of Bermuda Hundred. It dates back to 1613 when Sir Thomas Dale established one of the first settlements in colonial Virginia there. And in fact, it thrived up until World War I as a town. Now today it's a ghost town. There's only probably 20 houses left at Bermuda Hundred, primarily an African-American community of very little substance, but it was an important place. Butler says, I am supposed to control this peninsula and then wait for Meade to come to Richmond, and then I would cooperate with him. And that is going to be the source of some very strong misunderstandings which are going to lead to some disappointing results. So Grant meets with Butler on April the 1st. He comes away surprisingly impressed with General Butler. There are 39,000 troops in his army, about 17,000 in Gillmore's corps, about 17,000 in Smith's corps, and the remaining 5,000 are going to be split between the cavalry of August V. Couts and artillery soldiers. Okay. Now, Pickett is watching all of this unfold in front of him, and he is sending frantic messages to the War Department saying, you know, we've got some real problems developing out on the peninsula. The Confederates will react by naming that's not, there's the guy we were looking for, naming a new commander for a department that was called the Department of Southern Virginia and North Carolina, commanded by P.T.T. Butler. We all know General Beauregard, a man who did not get along with Jefferson Davis. Davis, I'm sure, must have had to bite his lip and swallow his pride to give Beauregard this assignment. Beauregard accepts it, immediately moves to Weldon, North Carolina, just south of the Virginia line, and then begins gathering troops from all over the map to try to respond to this burgeoning threat that Butler represents at Fort Monroe. And those troops, if you look at that table of organization, you can see where all they came from. Beauregard is going to get brigades from South Carolina, his old department in South Carolina. He's going to get brigades from East Tennessee. He's going to get brigades from Southwest Virginia. And he's going to tap on soldiers that are in the Department of Richmond. The Department of Richmond, commanded by a fellow named Robert Ransom. You know that the Confederates were plagued with this department system, in which there were particular geographic limitations. And unlike the Federals, everyone reports to Grant. But that unanimity of command did not exist in the Confederate Army. So Ransom is independent commander, Beauregard is an independent commander, Lee is an independent commander responsible only for their own forces. And this is going to create some problems as well. Okay, the campaign is about to begin. It's May the 5th, the opening day of the Battle of Walrus. It's also the opening day of the Bermuda 100 campaign, as 120 transport boats leave Fort Monroe and sail up the James River. They offload one division. Now, one of the 6 divisions of infantry in the Army of the James is an all-black division under Edward Hincks. They offload at City Point on the south side of the Appomattox River. But the other 5 divisions will get off here at Bermuda 100 Landing late in the afternoon, early in the evening, and by dark they had been they're completely offloaded. Now here's a little bit better view of the Bermuda 100 Peninsula, and you can see it's protected on both sides by rivers, and there's a deep water port here in the rear, and there's deep ravines on either side of the Bermuda 100 Peninsula as well. So this is where Butler gets off his transport boats. Here's the railroad and the turnpike connecting Richmond and Petersburg. And by this point, Butler has 39,000 troops off of his boats. That's between City Point and Bermuda 100. George Pickett has 1,400 troops. 39,000, 1,400. Pickett is, as again mentioned in your quiz, about on a 5-day ramp up to a nervous breakdown. He deploys one regiment in the Petersburg defenses. He calls out the Petersburg militia. The railroad is completely unguarded between the strong point, the Confederate strong point on the James River at Drury's Bluff, all the way down to Petersburg. Butler suggests to Gilmore and Smith, maybe it would be a good idea if we went forward, it's a moonlit night, and see what the Confederates are up to here. Smith and Gilmore, no, we don't want to risk a night advance. Butler says, okay, we'll do that. Pickett is sending messages to Beauregard, you've got to get up here. Beauregard says, you know, I'm not feeling very well. I'm not feeling well enough to travel, which is curious. Not suggesting that Beauregard was avoiding a crisis, but it's curious that he was too sick to travel. But he says, I'll send you this fellow. I'll send you D.H. Hill. And we all know D.H. Hill. You'll run into D.H. Hill in Chickamauga this spring. D.H. Hill will be yet the latest victim of Braxton Bragg's wrath, and will be dismissed from command, so he will be a lieutenant general without portfolio. And so he has signed on as a volunteer aide with Beauregard. And so Beauregard sends Hill up to calm down Pickett. And the Hill will get there on May the 6th as well. So, it is now May the 6th. The sun is up. Butler says, let's go forward. And he advances, but he is very cautious. And instead of making a dash for the unprotected railroad, he decides the first thing he needs to do is take care of mission number 1, and that's to begin fortifying this secure base. So he has Smith digging in on the left, anchored on the Appomattox River. He has Gilmore digging in on the right around something called Blair Bottom Church. And it's not until late in the afternoon of May the 6th that Butler says, let's go forward and see if there are any Confederates out there. And by this time, there were about 600 Confederates. And these were the first reinforcements to arrive in Petersburg. The South Carolinians coming up from Charleston under Johnson Haygood. Trivia question. What Division I football team has a football stadium named after Johnson Haygood? You can answer that after the meeting, Bruce. Smart ass. Okay. So, Butler is going to go forward on May the 6th, but he says, all right, I'm going to advance 1 brigade, Charles Heckman's brigade. And then when Heckman goes forward and gets fired on, his horse gets hit 9 times by these 600 South Carolinians, Heckman says, all right, I'm going to advance 1 regiment, the 9th New Jersey. And let's get through some of these guys. And here's the first battle of Fort Walpole Junction. Here's the poor 9th New Jersey. Here are these 600 Confederates of the 21st and 25th South Carolina. And needless to say, the 9th New Jersey gets punished a little bit and retreats, and Heckman falls back, and that is the first battle of Fort Walpole Junction. Combined casualties, about 150 men. Well, Butler decides on May the 7th that it might be a good idea if we advanced a few more, about 39,000 guys, and see if we couldn't achieve something more. Baldy Smith is all for this, and on May the 7th, they decide to deploy 1 brigade from each of the 5 infantry divisions on the Bermuda 100. So now we're up to committing 8,000 of the 39,000 men to advance against the Confederate Railroad. At the same time, our friend August Kautz, the cavalry commander, is off on a raid designed to burn the bridges south of Petersburg to break the railroad coming up from Weldon. And again, this is another digression which I won't indulge in, but Kautz has a very interesting raid in which he burns a couple of important bridges, lengthening the amount of time Beauregard's troops will need to get to Petersburg by 1 or 2 days. So Kautz is successful. The plan for May the 7th and the second battle of Fort Walpole Junction is for these 5 brigades, 3 of them under William T.H. Brooks, a name you may be familiar with, is going to entertain what is now about 2,700 Confederates because Bushrod Johnson has arrived in Richmond from southwest Virginia and has marched down through Drury's Bluff and has taken position at Fort Walpole Junction, which incidentally is a railroad junction between the main line running between Petersburg and Richmond and a spur line running to a port on the Appomattox River called Fort Walpole. While our friend General Heckman is going to be entertaining against the Confederate right, and a fellow named Plaisted is going to be attacking around the left. I'm not going to get into much of the tactics of these 8 little battles. Suffice it to say that Plaisted gains the railroad, tears up about 100 feet of the Richmond-Petersburg Railroad, and then falls back at the first sign of any resistance, and Brooks calls off the whole attack, and they fall back into the Bermuda 100 defenses. So here is, if you're keeping track, 3 days of missed opportunities for Butler to capture that most important railroad. Well, by this time, George Pickett is about losing it. He's done everything right so far, but he's about over the edge with his stress level. And so he orders all of the Confederate forces, which are now up to about 4,000, as more of Haygood's brigade has come in from the south, to abandon their positions around Port Walpole and take position behind Swift Creek, a large tributary of the Appomattox River. And if you remember from our field trips, if you've been there, that's the northern boundary of what is today the town of Colonial Heights. And he places these troops guarding all three of the bridges across Swift Creek, the railroad bridge, the turnpike bridge, and Brander's Bridge, and he also has some units here on a fort overlooking Fort Clifton. On May the 9th, on May the 8th, Butler decides to take the day off. He digs some more trenches. Now these fortifications are getting strong, but he takes the day off. On May the 9th, he somehow regains his equilibrium and decides he's going to go forward. He's going to send Gilmore's corps north to tear up the railroad, and he's going to send Smith's corps south to attack the Confederates behind Swift Creek. And he takes position, Smith's troops take position on the north side of the creek, as you see depicted on this map. Now, it is not just the Federals who have a monopoly on stupid command decisions at the Bermuda Hundred Campaign, because at this point, another character enters the story, Braxton Bragg, who is Jefferson Davis's military advisor in Richmond, basically the chief of staff for the Confederate military. And Bragg sends a nonsensical telegram to Pickett, telling Pickett, send guys up and repair the railroad around Chester Station, ignoring the fact that there's a Union Army Corps between him and Chester Station. Pickett, whose brain is about addled by this time, sends those orders on to his field commander on the scene, Bushrod Johnson. Now, Bushrod Johnson, despite a silly name, is not a silly officer, and he knows this is absurd. But orders are orders, and so he reduces this major advance to just a reconnaissance in force to two poor South Carolina regiments, who cross the bridge here and run into the teeth of this Federal presence and are slaughtered, as you might imagine. However, the Federals misinterpret this aggressive behavior by these Confederates as evidence of the fact that they must be very powerful. And that convinces the Federals to fall back from Swift Creek. And the sun sets on May the 9th with yet another missed opportunity. Now that, on the night of the 9th, though, Butler's about had it. He's already had it with Gilmore. He's had it with Gilmore. Gilmore's been disappointing him. He's been disobeying orders. He's been way overcautious. Butler has already contacted his pal in Washington, Senator Henry Wilson of Massachusetts, in charge of one of the major military committees in the Senate, to get rid of Gilmore. Don't confirm him as a major general and replace him. And Butler says, you know, guys, to Smith and Gilmore, we need to make an attack against Petersburg tomorrow. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to mass all these troops, and we're going to force our way across the bridges at Swift Creek. I don't think there's that many Confederates there. And then we're going to burn the bridges across the Appomattox River, and we're going to isolate Petersburg from Richmond completely. Gilmore and Smith are at this meeting that night, and they say, okay, all right, boss, sounds good, boss. Butler rides away. Gilmore and Smith get together and say, now what are we really going to do? And they come up with a plan, which is a completely different plan. And they're going to say, you know, what we need to do is move all of our troops across the pontoon bridge downriver on the Appomattox, go across the south side of the Appomattox, and come into Petersburg from the side. That way we won't have to fight these Confederates, who we think are a lot stronger at Swift Creek. And they send this memo, you know, to Butler. Butler reads this and says, oh my, you got to be kidding. 30 minutes ago, these guys agreed to my plan. Now they got an entirely different plan. But it turns out to be moot, because in only the latest series of guffaws, a message arrives from the War Department in Washington at this time, from no less a personage than Secretary of War, Edward Stanton. And Stanton tells Butler, hey, good news. Grant and Meade are driving Lee away from Spotsylvania towards the defenses of Richmond. Now is the time for you to move forward and execute the rest of your mission and move up to Richmond and cooperate with Meade, who's going to be getting on the other side of the James River. So Butler says, forget the attacks against Petersburg, and now we're going to focus on going to Richmond. All right. Now we're on May the 10th.
all of this is unfolding. But Butler says, you know, we're going to need a little time to get organized. So not much happens down around the south side, but up north of Chester Station, which is about, exit 61, about 11 miles north of Petersburg. Robert Ransom, that fellow who was in charge of the Department of Richmond for the Confederates, who has his brigades at Drury's Bluff, decides, you know, I think all these Yankees have got their backs to me. They're all worried about Swift Creek. What happens if I take a couple of my brigades down here, Archibald Gracie's Alabamians and Seth Barton's Virginians, and maybe we can attack the Federals there at Chester Station and catch them with their pants down. And they make this assault on May the 10th. And they do drive three poor Union regiments, the 13th Indiana, the 169th New York, and the 67th Ohio, away from Chester Station. But then Alfred Terry sends a couple of brigades up to rescue the situation here. Gracie doesn't get involved in the battle at all. Barton commits his troops in a piecemeal fashion in a very poor manner. The Confederates suffer about 300 casualties at the battle, and Ransom will retreat back into the defenses at Drury's Bluff. So the Battle of Chester Station is a Union victory, a poorly managed tactical attack by the Confederates. May 10th, the same time this is going on, our friend General Beauregard has finally felt well enough to come to Petersburg. But by now, the bridges are out on the railroad. Kautz has burned the bridges, so he has to go all the way to Greensboro, North Carolina, up to Danville, Virginia, across to Burkeville, and into Petersburg that way. He arrives on May 10th along with the bulk of his reinforcements under Robert Hoke from North Carolina, who's finally arrived from Kinston, and Beauregard tells Hoke that we have got to do something to rescue Pickett. Pickett by this time says, thank God you're here, and collapses to his bed. LaSalle will administer to him at his headquarters in Petersburg, which still exists. Okay, now it is May 11th, and Beauregard says, you know, Hope, we need to try to do something to deal with Butler here, when a frantic message arrives from Richmond. Now we have a new threat enters the scene. All these characters, the Bermuda 100, they know Phil Sheridan. I didn't know Phil Sheridan had anything to do with Bermuda 100. Well, you know, remember what happened to Sheridan at Spotsylvania. Remember when he had that tiff with Meade? And he tells Meade, if you'll just let me alone, I can whip Judge Stewart out of his boots. And Meade is outraged by this insubordination and goes to Grant to complain about Sheridan. And Grant says, Phil said that? Well, he must mean it. And so he gave Sheridan the green light, you might remember, to take 10,000 cavalry and go after Jeb Stuart, and of course mortally wounds Jeb Stuart at the Yellow Tavern on the 11th of May. Well, while all of this is unfolding north of Richmond, what's the Confederate War Department thinking? Geez, we got problems to the south of Butler, now we got an attack from the north from Sheridan, we need help north of the James. And so all of Ransom's troops from Drury's Bluff get called to the north side of the James to deal with Sheridan. This means chances for offensives for Beauregard are put on the shelf, but Beauregard on the 11th of May orders Hoke with 4 brigades to go north to Drury's Bluff to take the position of Ransom's troops who are now dealing with Sheridan, if you're following me on all of this. But how in the world is Hoke with 8,000 guys going to get to Drury's Bluff with the Army of the James between them and Drury's Bluff? The Army of the James is in its defenses with Bermuda 100 and leaves the railroad and turnpike open. I'm reminded of the situation at Spring Hill. Remember when the Union Army marched right under the nose of Hood's army at Spring Hill before the Battle of Franklin? Same kind of a thing. Hoke sends all these troops right up the Richmond-Petersburg Turnpike, right under Butler's nose, and on May 11th, they are in the trenches at Drury's Bluff. Okay, now we have gotten to May the 12th, and Butler, again, in his sort of yo-yo attitude between being aggressive and being passive, has decided the time has come to go north and attack the Confederates at Drury's Bluff. Not so much to capture Richmond, but as a diversion to make sure that no more troops go north to reinforce Lee, and also as a diversion in favor of yet another cavalry raid being orchestrated by August Kautz. And now Butler sends 3 of his 5 divisions northward, all of Smith's Corps, which is on the scene, and 1 division, John W. Turner's division of Gilmore's Corps, north towards Drury's Bluff on May the 12th. And they will advance slowly. They'll get almost to Drury's Bluff by the end of the day on May the 12th. Beauregard by this time has decided he's going to go north. He has to go out a long roundabout way to get to Drury's Bluff. And he is going to get into Drury's Bluff in the morning of the 13th. Now let's get to this next map. Now at this point, the advance, you can see the advance up towards Drury's Bluff of these federal troops. And Smith's 18th Corps is located just south of the main Confederate defenses, and Gilmore's Corps is going to be orchestrating a flank movement around the Confederate right to their left through the county seat at Chesterfield Courthouse. And on the 13th of May, another one of these battles in the Bermuda Hundred Campaign unfolds, in which Gilmore's Corps makes this long flank march and attacks the Confederates who are located along what is known as the outer defense line. And parts of this line are still there. Now we're getting into parts of the campaign which you can actually visit. And at the end, if we have any time, I'll tell you, make a comment or two about what you can still see out there on the ground. But the Confederate defense line at Drury's Bluff was anchored here at a place called Fort Stevens. The outer line went like this and then anchored itself on a high hill known as Woolridge Hill. Woolridge Hill. The Woolridge House is still there today. The main line went west from Fort Stevens, across the railroad, then north off the map, then back east to anchor above the fort on the James River. So that was the fortification. And on this attack at the Battle of Woolridge Hill, Gilmore actually is able to turn the Confederate flank here and drive the Confederates away from the outer line on the 13th. They severely wound the little fellow who we had a picture of just quickly there, Matt Ransom, Robert Ransom's brother, who's a brigade commander at this time. The 3rd New Hampshire and the 49th North Carolina are the 2 regiments that get slaughtered in this battle. If you had an ancestor in the 3rd New Hampshire or the 49th North Carolina, this little obscure battle you've never heard of would have been a big landmark on their career. And so now it's the 14th of May, and Beauregard has arrived at Drury's Bluff. And we all know what Beauregard's strategic thinking is like. He thinks big, does he, Kurt? He's a big thinker. And here's his plan. He says, here's what we'll do. We'll get Lee to come down here to Drury's Bluff. And then he will join my forces, and we'll defeat Butler. And then together, we'll go back across the James River, and we'll defeat Grant, and everything will be cool. Bragg comes down and listens to this with his mouth open and says, I don't think I'm really qualified to comment on this. Perhaps I should bump this up to the president. And the president comes down to Drury's Bluff, and he listens to this and says, you've got to be kidding, Beauregard. This is ridiculous. No, what you're going to do is you're going to bring every Confederate who's in Petersburg right now, you're going to bring them up to Drury's Bluff, and you're going to defeat Butler, and you're going to keep Richmond safe from the south. By this time, Sheridan has ridden off into the sunset on the Middle Peninsula of the Virginia tidewater, and so he's no longer a threat. So they're not worried about Sheridan anymore. They're all focused on Butler. And Beauregard listens to this and says, okay, sure, okay, all right, you're the boss. Well, you know how Beauregard and Davis get along. I mean, as soon as Davis rides away, Beauregard says, okay, now I know what I'm going to do. And he sends word down to the man who is now in charge at Petersburg. And this is another sort of second-tier guy you've probably heard of, William Henry Chase Whiting. General Whiting, who has been in command at Wilmington, has come up with the last couple of brigades of troops that were now along the Cape Fear River as reinforcements for Beauregard. And Beauregard has met with Whiting for about an hour to brief him on the situation, then leaves. Whiting's looking around saying, all right, well, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Now, Whiting was a bright guy. Whiting had the best academic record at West Point until Douglas MacArthur surpassed him in 1903. He was a very skilled officer. He had a drinking problem, though, and this is what really hurt his career. So he is in Petersburg, and Beauregard sends word to Whiting and says, the president wants you to come up here to join me and go on defense of Drury's Bluff, but I got a better idea. What you're going to do is you're going to take 2 brigades at Petersburg. You're going to move up from the south. I'm going to attack Butler at Drury's Bluff from the north. You're going to hit him in the rear. I'm going to hit him in the front. We're going to drive him away from his line of communications at Bermuda 100, and we're going to destroy him together. Whiting says, oh, well, okay, that's what we're supposed to do. And on the 15th, the plans are laid for this assault. Beauregard divides his forces. He's got about 17,500 men at Drury's Bluff. He divides them into 3 divisions. He's got Robert Ransom in charge of 4 brigades. He's got Robert Hoke in charge of 4 brigades. He's got Matt Ransom's brigade and Alfred Colquitt's brigade as reserve troops with him at that time. And the target for Beauregard's assault is going to be the Union right flank. Now that's the relevant map here. As you can see, here is the Union line, a portion of the Union line. The James River is just off the map to the right here, and our poor friend Charles Heckman has got his flank in the air. And this is going to be the attack that Ransom is going to make, going to get around the flank. And then when that occurs, Hoke is going to hit the front of the Union line. At this point, Whiting is going to come in from the rear and hit the rear of Butler's line, as Butler's line is reeling from these flank and front attacks. And you've got to give Beauregard his due. This is pretty good. This is a pretty good plan, even though it's insubordinate to the president. It's a pretty good plan. Butler wants to attack on the 15th, but guess what? Smith and Gilmore say, no, I'm not strong enough. I don't want to do that. So the time has been given for Beauregard to make this attack. The numbers are about even. 17,544 regiments for the Confederates, about 17,038 regiments for the Federals. And on the morning of the 16th, the attack at 4 a.m. gets underway. The problem is that it is a dense fog. Visibility is practically zero. And as as Ransom's men come around the flank here, they turn the poor 9th New Jersey flank. General Heckman rides out to see what's going on in the darkness and the fog. He's immediately captured. By 9 in the morning, he's in Libby prison. About 400 of the Confederates become captives. About 300, the Federals, about 300 of them become casualties, killed or wounded. But in the fog and in the dark, command and control is practically nil for the Confederate attackers, and Ransom's assault bogs down. In the center, down here at Halfway House, did you all experience the Halfway House on your tour by any chance? No. Butler's headquarters, Smith was down here. It's a great restaurant today. That's the original building. It's a wonderful place to eat dinner. They will send reinforcements up to deal with the shattered right flank, which is going to stop any progress that Ransom is going to make. And then in the center, Butler tells Gilmore, make an attack. The Confederates are weak someplace. Gilmore doesn't do it. Beauregard tells Hoke, you make an attack with your 4 brigades. Hoke's men come across the no man's land between the lines, and all of them fall down like a Saturday Night Live skit, because the Federals had strung telegraph wire across tree stumps. In the dark and the fog, they don't see it, and this must have been sort of a tragic comic scene as hundreds of guys hit the ground and are shot by the Federals. Things are going very poorly for the Confederates. This attack, which had a good plan, is not being executed. And at that very moment, Baldy Smith says, we're in deep trouble. We got to withdraw. And so he orders the 18th Corps to fall back from the battle line, despite all evidence to the contrary. Gilmore sees this and says, oh my God, my flank is open, and I don't know what I'm going to do. And Butler says, attack, attack. Gilmore says, I'm not going to attack. And now Beauregard has the opportunity to take advantage of an open flank on the Union right, with half the Union Army having withdrawn. But Beauregard says, no, I don't want to go forward because I'm expecting Whiting to hear Whiting's guns any minute. I want to wait till Whiting comes up in the rear. Well, Whiting, I'll tell you about Whiting in a second. Whiting doesn't come up. Gilmore finally says, I got to get out of here, boss. I'm out here by myself. And Butler says, okay, fall back. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Federals have established a strong line around the halfway house. Beauregard is still wondering what the hell has happened to Whiting, and he doesn't go forward. And by 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the 16th, Butler says, I think this is over. Nothing else is going to happen. We're going to fall back into our defensive lines at Bermuda 100, and they do so, and the battle is over. The casualties are not insignificant to the Battle of Drury's Bluff. The Federals will lose about 3,100 killed and wounded, and another 1,400 captured. So this is no small battle. The Confederate losses are less precise, probably about 3,000 killed or wounded. But this begs the question, what happened to our friend Chase Whiting? Well, Whiting is under the impression that Petersburg, not Richmond, is the real target of the Federals. Butler has left behind 2 small regiments under Adelbert Ames, north of Fort Walthall Junction, to guard his rear against any Confederate threat. Just 2 small regiments. Whiting has not slept for about 48 hours. He is under tremendous strain, and in his tortured mind believes that the Federals are about to descend on him from both flanks. And despite the pleas, the imprecations of D.H. Hill, of Henry Wise, of James Martin, the officers who are in along with Chase Whiting in the 16th, to go forward. There are not enough Yankees up there to worry about. Whiting will not go forward. There's a small engagement here in which the casualties number about 100, and that's enough for Chase Whiting to fall back into the defenses of Petersburg, thinking that he has just dodged a major bullet. Henry Wise, one of his brigade commanders, swears that Whiting was dead drunk. That's why he acted the way he was. But the scholars who studied the campaign say, no, Whiting wasn't drunk. Probably was like Joe Hooker at Chancellorsville. Probably could have had a stiff drink that would have done him some good. He was just tired and stressed out. And so there was also an acoustic shadow that day. We're all familiar with these acoustic shadows, these atmospheric conditions in which the sound does not carry as it normally would. And so Whiting did not hear the sounds of this major battle taking place 7 miles to the north of him at Drury's Bluff. And so he was unaware that there was a fight going on. And so that's all for Chase Whiting. On the 17th, Beauregard tells Whiting, I think it's best if you go back to Wilmington. Whiting says, that's fine with me. And D.H. Hill takes Whiting's place in command at Petersburg. Well, now Beauregard is going to pursue Butler into the Bermuda 100 Peninsula, but all of that digging that we talked about a half an hour ago that Butler was doing has borne fruit, because those fortifications are way too strong for Beauregard to attack. On the 19th of May, the disintegration of Beauregard's army begins as Robert E. Lee is successful in getting the War Department to order picket and 4 brigades to to abandon Beauregard's army and go north, and where they will join with Lee's army at the north end. And this is a process that will continue through the rest of the month. There is one more engagement at the Bermuda Hundred campaign, however, and that's on May the 20th. A battle with very limited objectives. Beauregard, recognizing that he probably wasn't going to be able to break through the Bermuda Hundred lines, still wanted to create the shortest possible defense line for the Confederates that he could create. And he could do so by taking a Union picket line here around a place called Ware Bottom Church. And by doing so, he could anchor his left flank on the James River at the Howlett House, and then continue his line down to the Appomattox River, a line that was the smallest, the most narrow part of the peninsula, only about 3 miles in length. And make a long story short, there is a sharp engagement on the 20th around Ware Bottom Church, 1,700 combined casualties at this battle. Beauregard is successful in capturing the Union picket line, and he will establish that defense line called the Howlett Line, named after the Howlett House, that Confederates will hold until they abandon Richmond and Petersburg on April 2nd, 1865. Now, Grant sends 2 inspectors, John Barnard and Montgomery Meigs, down to Bermuda Hundred with one question. Is Butler occupying as many Confederate troops as Butler's got? Because if not, I've got other things I can do with them. Meigs, Barnard come down and they report back to Grant, no. And you really ought to get rid of Butler. Well, he doesn't get rid of Butler, but he tells Butler, send Smith's Corps to me. And as you know, the 18th Corps is involved in some of the most, I'm sure that Bobby Crick or whoever was your guide, Ed, whoever was your guide at Cold Harbor, showed you that ground where the 18th Corps made that fatal assault on June 3rd, 1864 at the Battle of Cold Harbor. At the same time, Polk's division of 4 brigades on May 30th, once they discovered that Smith had departed, and here's Smith. Smith's route is to go back down the James River into Hampton Roads, up the York River, up the Pamunkey River, and then offload here at White House Landing. Polk had a much shorter route to reinforce Lee's army. All Polk had to do was leave Drury's Bluff and march into Richmond and up to Cold Harbor area here. And so both Polk and Smith were heavily engaged at the Battle of Cold Harbor, limiting the forces at Bermuda Hundred even more. Lee was successful in getting Matt Ransom's brigade transferred on June the 4th, and so by the first week in June, Beauregard's force had gone from 23,000 to only about 5,400. In the meantime, old Butler is very frustrated. He wants to accomplish something. He schedules an attack against Petersburg on May 29th, but then the transports arrive for Smith's Corps and he has to call them off. He schedules another attack for June 2nd, and then the Confederates make a small attack on his lines, and that prompts him to call that off. He finally orchestrates an attack on June the 9th, the only battle that is still commemorated in Petersburg by the people of Petersburg. It's known as the Battle of Old Men and Young Boys. You might remember the story of the 125 men in their 60s and boys under the age of 16 that rushed from their homes to man the defenses south of Petersburg against Kautz's cavalry and Gillmore's infantry. Gillmore doesn't make an attack. That's his fatal flaw. He'll get fired. Kautz does not succeed in getting into Petersburg, and by this time, Grant has given up maneuvering around Lee's army north of the James, and on June the 12th, he begins transporting his troops across the James River, and the Bermuda Hundred campaign gets morphed into the Petersburg campaign, and that our story at Bermuda Hundred comes to a conclusion. So what can we draw? What can we draw from the story of Bermuda Hundred here? I'm not sure it's quite the comedy of errors, that perhaps I had led you to believe it was. If you had asked Butler what he had accomplished, he would tell you with a straight face and with some justification that he had accomplished 2 of his 3 goals. He'd certainly created a strong base at Bermuda 100. Now, what is the one quote that you came into this room knowing about Bermuda 100? Rob? Cork in the bottle. Butler was trapped in Bermuda 100 like a cork in the bottle. Well, that was a phrase that Barnard used in his investigation of the situation, and Grant would repeat in his report in July 1865. And historians have used that quote ever since. Unfortunately, it is not at all true. And you know this. He's not trapped in Bermuda 100. He's got a pontoon bridge that goes to Petersburg. He's got a deep water port. He transported half of his men without any opposition at all to Cold Harbor. So if you came with the idea that Butler was trapped in Bermuda 100, that's entirely false. And Grant said he regretted using that term because it was inaccurate. Secondly, Butler would tell you, hey, I busted up the railroad for two weeks. And I kept thousands of troops occupied that didn't go to fight Grant at Spotsylvania, North Anna, and Cold Harbor. The only thing I didn't do, Butler would tell you, was I didn't capture Richmond. But I wasn't about to do that by myself anyway. It depended on Meade to come down and do that, and Meade never got there. So that would be Butler's argument. And I'll let you decide whether that is, the 2 books that I referenced have 2 different opinions. 2 different opinions on that, so I'll let you decide for yourself. I will say to you that I doubt any commander could have been entirely successful having Quincy Gilmore and Baldy Smith as their primary lieutenants. On the Confederate side, Pickett, I think, did a good job. He got all of the troops in the right place at the right time. He organized the reinforcements correctly. Of course, he paid for all of that with a nervous breakdown. But at the end of the game, he was restored his command in the Army of Northern Virginia and would fight under Lee the rest of the Petersburg campaign. Beauregard, not so good in some ways. His absence at Petersburg, I think, was suspicious. His plan that he suggested to Bragg and Davis was ridiculous. But on the other hand, the battle plan that he developed at Drury's Bluff could work. But he was let down by poor performance by Ransom and a particularly poor performance by Chase Whiting. So I would say that in essence, if you want to study the way to conduct a Civil War military campaign, don't go to Bermuda. Thanks very much for your attention. Questions from every table except that table back there with my family and friends. No questions? Here's one.
What happened to Butler that for 12,000 men? We talked about that was 39,000 and then when they got to Drury, you're at 17,000.
Okay, the question is, what happened to Butler's, how come he didn't have 39,000 at Drury's Bluff, he only had 17,000? He used 3 of his 6 divisions at Drury's Bluff. One of the divisions, the Black Division, is down at City Point. And I didn't, obviously this goes on long enough, you can't go into all of this stuff, but what Hinks's division was doing was threatening Petersburg from the east. And he left 2 other divisions, Ames's division and Terry's division, one of them in reserve at Bermuda 100 and the other sort of on the turnpike between his rear and Swift Creek, watching his rear. So perhaps that was a little bit overcautious, but in fact, of course, Whiting could have threatened his rear, and he would have needed those troops. So that's what happened to the rest of his troops. Larry?
Well, can you please give us an update on the financial condition of Pamplin Park?
An update on the financial condition from Pamplin Park. Are you the auditor, Larry, or Dad, do I have to disclose this? No, we had a very good year last year. I'm happy to tell you. Thank you for asking. Our revenues were up about 12%, and we were able to hire a couple more people. And, I think the economy's turning around a little bit in terms of tourism in Virginia anyway. Maybe there's a bump from the sesquicentennial. I'm not sure. Our attendance was only up a small amount, but the revenues were up. And we appreciate all the support that many of you in this room give to the park. It's tough out there. It's tough out there in the nonprofit private sector to maintain parks and museums, but as long as we've got great friends like you, I'm sure we'll be fine. We had a good year last year, Larry. Thank you. Anything else?
What's the stadium?
What's the stadium?
You only got 3 Division I schools.
Bruce, do you know what 2 stadiums in the United States are named after Civil War officers? 2. One of them is Johnson Haygood, and the other is somebody else. The Citadel is right for Haygood, of course. You know the other one. Penn State, Beaver Stadium, James Beaver. Yeah, there you go. On that note, let me just get over here. Okay, well, we've had some hard economic times here at the Civil War Roundtable also, and in keeping with our theme of the intergalactic battles between the Cubs and the White Sox, we have decided, in lieu of the normal nice prize package that we give our Nevins Freeman Award, we have given you, because you and I talked about this on the internet, as a matter of fact, just 2 days ago. It gave me a brilliant idea to go down to my basement and find this prize for you, which is Kosuke Fukudomi's bobblehead. I'm speechless. All I can say is, you're in trouble when you get the Cubs rejects. Seriously, though, we did through the auspices of the bookstore come up with the prize which we have normally given to the Nevins Freeman Award winner. That would be Gateway to History by Ellen Nevins, and The South to Posterity by Douglas Southall Freeman, and we present that to you. Bill, we're not done. We have the new car. Do we have the car right? Oh, no. Okay. And for speaking, and thank you so much for really filling in the last piece of the puzzle to the Petersburg tour, which we all thoroughly enjoyed. And I was so happy to make your acquaintance, because we were talking at the table 5 years ago when this idea first hatched and it came to fruition. And except for Ed losing his car keys, locking his car keys in the rental car, okay, that was a minor problem. But we have a check to present on your behalf to Pamplin Park as a donation for Steve. The festivities, you can follow the evolution of the Cub Sox demise for the year through spring training, where whole spring's eternal, except for these 2 teams this year. My advice is to follow the Hawks and probably follow the Bulls. I think that'll be much better. Next month's talk will be with some guy named Krolik. He will be speaking on the 8th Illinois, fighting for the 8th Illinois Cavalry. We should have some guests from the 8th Illinois Cavalry.